Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This is a fully independent podcast. Lend your support, rockfin.com/aroundtheempire, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please like, share, and subscribe. Sharmine Narwani is our guest for this episode. We talk about Gaza, the resistance, and the differences between the attacks on Gaza in past years and what happened in the most recent ones. And about who really needs a ceasefire the most, why a ceasefire with no real change doesn't really help the Palestinians. We talk about reactions from other countries in the region to the latest attack on Gaza. And Sharmine provides an update on the current situation in Lebanon, which has fallen out of the news of late, but it's still in crisis. It still deals with foreign interference. Lastly, we talked about a new media project that Sharmine and others will be launching soon. And in a bonus question, we talk about the evolution of the map of Palestine and Israel since World War II and how that map might change going forward, essentially the future of Israel and Palestine. We recorded this last week, just a couple of days before the ceasefire was announced. Also a couple days before I had a minor surgical procedure that resulted in a longer recovery time than expected. So my apologies for the week's delay in publishing. Sharmine Narwani's here with us, speaking to us from Beirut. Hello, Sharmine. Thanks so much for coming back on the show. It's great to see you again.
It's great to see you too, Joanne.
So I'm looking to you with some big questions for today, for mainly on Gaza, of course, for some more perspective on that, of the current attack, what led to it, and I'm very interested in the overall resistance perspective on this. I'm seeing some things I haven't seen before. And maybe we could also get into the reactions in Lebanon, in other countries in the region. And I know that's a lot, and I'm giving you a wide open field here, but I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on these things.
Okay, so the situation in Palestine's been about a week now that things have imploded. And what's absolutely fascinating about this round is that Palestinians it started in Jerusalem, right?
Right.
The Israeli settlers trying to occupy the homes of Palestinians in Jerusalem. And then there was a big gathering at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and, chants, and then there were skirmishes and a lot of Palestinians were brutalized by security forces and settlers. And so we suddenly saw Gaza respond to Jerusalem. That's not what happens. It's usually the Israelis attack Gaza and it's Gaza, Israel, right? So in this case, the Gaza responded to Jerusalem as though they were one. Mm. And then Palestinians in Israel, who were Israeli citizens, because they're within the 1948 territories, also rose up. And we saw many videos of Jewish Israelis hunting down Arabs, calling for Arab blood, and Arabs fighting back and Arabs demonstrating. And then now we see the West Bank rise up. So, you have to understand that Israel has worked methodically in the last decades to separate these Palestinian units. So Gaza from the West Bank, Jerusalem from the West Bank, Palestinians inside Israel from the 1967 territories, and keeping them in, these units, as it were, has helped divide and rule, basically. So for Israel to have, allowed the violence and in Jerusalem to go unchecked resulted in something they didn't expect. They thought they would just easily occupy Palestinian homes, there'd be some outcry, but it's one city, for goodness sakes. Trump gave it to Israel, while he was president, gave it. Not that he has any authority and not that it recognizes it, but so, it would be just brushed over and on we move. And that's not what happened. Every Palestinian unit rose up. And as people were getting killed, the determination to stay on the streets and make settlers and soldiers alike pay has risen. So every day there are new things planned. I mean, we saw a massive demonstration in Ramallah today. So, they say when the West Bank is on fire, that's it. They will not stop. And it's been so long since we've seen the West Bank on fire. I mean, really, I remember going there, I think I was very young, the first and second intifadas. It was the second intifada. And then, the Madrid Peace Conference happened. And the next time I went to the West Bank was years later, and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe Ramallah. It was like, a little city instead of a scrappy old town, all right? It was a little city. They had like new apartment buildings. They had rooftop bars. They had, nightlife. It was, and I noticed that the young activist journalists that I'd known back when I first visited were now people maybe hired by Western media. They had 2 cars, kids were in private school, and there was all the energy was sucked out by the US and EU money that had flooded into the West Bank. And that was part of the goal, to make people complacent and fearful of losing, having enough that they would be fearful to lose it. So to see the West Bank rise up again like this is truly extraordinary. To see Palestinians inside the 1948 borders rise up like this I've never seen it.
Really?
So basically in one fell, people have been asking me in the last few days, have these rockets from Gaza established deterrence? And I would say no. They'd have to have a few more tricks up their sleeve for that, militarily at least. But the big surprise deterrence that we might see after this episode is, if in fact it finishes, is the fear that if they hit Gaza now, again, the Israelis in the future, that all the territories, all their Palestinian units will rise up.
I see.
So that would be, they would have second thoughts, okay, just as they've had second thoughts about hitting Lebanon since 2006, despite all their threats and continuous threats. So deterrence is really about making people think twice, and then making people draw away from confrontation. And in this case, if Israel assesses that if they hit Gaza again, so Gaza's always been a punching bag, a very convenient punching bag for the Israelis, because, Israel's been increasingly frustrated. During the course of the Syrian war, they thought they'd win that depth of Syria by having Assad kicked out and going to his opponents, that they would win that strategic depth. And that would finish off Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they would secure Iraq, US troops are there, whatever, and Iran would be isolated. But that didn't happen. So Israel has been very frisky because they've been very frustrated at things not going their way. And for the resistance axis, going from strength to strength after the worst of the Syrian battle was over. And Hezbollah getting field experience that they hadn't had in ever, really, in this conflict, and all of them, even including Iraqis and Russians now, major world power, working from the same command center. So these were extraordinary events, and Israel felt trapped. At one point, they saw themselves as going all the way into Iraq to the Tigris, and the imagination of a greater Israel, Eretz Israel, right? Suddenly gone overnight. So as Israel gets nervous about its situation, anxious, it tends to strike out like a bully, and Gaza's been that punching bag. But in this case, I think they're going to have to think twice in the future. What they typically do, by the way, and I know this from Hamas officials from, by the way, the 2014 attack on Gaza that took well over 2,000 lives. Hamas officials have told me that every time Israel starts bombarding Gaza, they go on day one to the UN Security Council, to their allies in the West, to their allies in the east, Jordan, Egypt, etc., and try to get the ceasefire process started. So knowing that their friends are taking care of this, they then bombard the hell out of Gaza, knowing that it's going to be a short episode, right? Because ceasefires will be offered, etc., and Israel will look like they're being dragged to the ceasefire table. We're still ready to punch Gaza, and that's and then they get their ceasefire, and this is a real problem. And I wrote about this in 2014. I said, stop these ceasefires. Do not have a ceasefire. And I tracked previous ceasefires to 2014. Every instance, Israel delivers nothing that it's promised. Okay, so they actually anticipated this time that they wouldn't get a reaction from Gaza with what was going on in Jerusalem, because they'd opened the borders enough to get food and supplies into Gaza recently, right? And they completely miscalculated, because now we are really seeing a whole different Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the various groups in Gaza. They, instead of being fearful of another confrontation, which is what the Israeli analysts had anticipated, they were shocked to see them come out all together in full force, same agendas, nobody backing down, with a whole new military arsenal, and a lot of it. So I think, in one sense, if the forces in Gaza are working together, that's a threat, because militarily, okay, that's a threat to Israel. If the forces in Gaza will coordinate with Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Palestinians inside Israel, that's a double threat. And the third threat, and I think we still have to wait to see this, is what kind of military arsenal Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the other groups have to surprise us, and whether there will be weapons in the West Bank that we haven't seen. Well, we've seen Fatah's military arm in the West Bank march with weapons and their bandanas and masks. So that's something we haven't seen in a while.
Yeah.
And so many things are coming to the fore now, because as Palestinians rise up in the West Bank, a reality sets in that what are the Palestinian security forces supposed to do? They've really been, holding the occupation for the Israeli security forces all these years after Oslo. And so, the question is, are we going to kill our own people? Or are we going to back down and let them do what they have to? Of course, right before this all blew up, Mahmoud Abbas, the acting head of the Palestinian Authority, canceled planned elections, because it was very clear that Hamas would still, regardless of the many problems they've had in the territories and in Gaza, would probably emerge victorious. So really, the Palestinian Authority is surrounded itself. It doesn't know what to do. It's never had to deal with a situation like this since Oslo. And so many things that are interesting, I think, that we will discover, hopefully, in the days and weeks ahead, and months potentially, because really the Palestinians should not accept any ceasefire. They should accept nothing less than the end to occupation and the return of Palestinians to their lands. And this has always been the only way for them to get it. They should never rely on others to get this, not on the Americans, who are dishonest mediators, not on other Arab countries who, have shady relations with Israel and always have, but on themselves. And we saw that with the first and second intifadas. And to be honest, why should they stop? Why should they stop until? Because you know what I said in 2014 in this article I wrote about don't accept a ceasefire, was the death toll is now at over 2,000 dead. Okay. And people in English are using genocide and Israel in the same sentence for the first time in my lifetime that I recall. Okay. And I'm talking mainstream even. And apartheid is very commonly used at that point. But if you accept a ceasefire now, that death toll goes back to zero. And they've set a new bar for the death toll. So next time, and there will always be a next time, because Gaza is Israel's punching bag, they will just, hundreds dead mean nothing, because we've seen 2,000 now. It was a big failure in my view to take a bashing like that and not use it to their advantage to get something substantial from Israel. And I really hope they do it now, because they've never had a more favorable position, as hard and horrible as it is for Palestinians right now.
Right. Now, a little bit more on the official Palestinian Authority. They're supposed to keep a lid on things, and they're supposed to negotiate with Israel. I assume this kind of resistance is not supposed to happen under their rule. Did they change, or was there organizing that was done uh, outside of them, or is this an organic, or maybe all three? I don't know.
Okay. So it's a very good question, because I mean, I don't actually know publicly that anyone has an answer. There is an element to the Gaza response that seems orchestrated, or maybe not orchestrated, maybe prepared. So they were prepared to go. They'd been training to go. They had been amassing weapons to go. So there is some preparation, and maybe the preparation was just simply for an incident like this, or the next time Israel decided to punch out Gaza.
It was inevitable. So
but there are, I mean, for instance, there are many other incidents where I thought surely Palestinians will do something now, and one of those was, of course, the Jerusalem issue, when Trump, bestowed Jerusalem to the Israelis. You thought they'd rise up then. And there have been many provocations over the years. So what makes this different? Who knows? I think Israel is becoming more and more right-wing every year. And we're hearing what Israelis are saying openly now, about Arabs and killing Arabs and getting rid of Arabs, right? And taking their homes and mocking them, right? And just beating up on random Arabs, and breaking up Arab businesses. So we're just seeing this now, but this goes on all the time. And I think certainly you could credit on the most important day of the most holy month of Ramadan, when they attacked Al-Aqsa and the worshippers there. That very easily could just have been another thing that set things off. I mean, it was an important. It shouldn't have been done, and it may have been the straw that broke the camel's back. So there's a little bit of preparation we do see, right? But that could have been going on anyways. And then of course we have this incident. So it's usually a couple of things that coincide and things explode. And sometimes it's one death. That particularly hits people hard. In America, people die every day, but then you have Black men are killed every day by the American police forces, right? But it's one death that suddenly makes a big difference. So it's hard to say, and I don't think we'll know for some time.
Yeah. So as far as Lebanon goes, first of all, Lebanon was in the news every day for quite a while, and it seems to have, at least here, sort of dropped out of our news. Like, how are things there? And then maybe after that we could talk about the response to this latest attack inside Lebanon.
Things are terrible here. Banks are not giving people their money, and that's been going on for a year. Yeah. It's I think it started in October, November of 2019. So that still continues. At that point, they were giving you a little bit every week or month, and that's completely stopped. There have been a few lawsuits, but there almost seems no point to many, because the justice system, many systems here are corrupt, and no judge is going to force a bank to give back earnings and open up, Pandora's box basically, and bankrupt the entire system and there not being money. I mean, the question is there money even for the deposits in these banks? I mean, there are a lot of questions. And there's been real pushback from the corrupt leaders who've always been in power, including the central bank governor here, Riyad Salameh, who is an American favorite and has been protected by the Americans throughout this entire process. When Lebanon's prime minister who is now its acting prime minister because the government resigned basically, tried to get rid of Salameh, he was stopped. I mean, he was stopped from doing a lot of things. And people say he wasn't bold enough, but he was bolder than any prime minister I've seen in the, many years that I've been coming here. He was willing to push back on some important things and empower some fair people. So right now, the currency has also fallen. So it was in late 2019, it was 1,500 Lebanese liras to the dollar. And today it's almost 13,000 Lebanese lira to the dollar. And people are more or less getting paid in liras, the salaries they were, if they have a job, because a good part of the population has lost their jobs. Because, these hit everything. You can be a big business doing well, but it hits you in some way. So you stop getting supplies from this person, you move to another supplier, all these things just have a domino effect. And it's absolutely hurt the economy here. And people are surviving. But we expect in June, we've been told in June by the central bank that they're out of money and they will have to remove subsidies on food, medicine, and oil and gas. And so, I think we expect an explosion of some sort here. But I want to say, given all this, it didn't just happen in a vacuum. I mean, there was a date at which things were going to be troublesome for the financial and banking system in this country because some loans were due. But I think it was just a convenient time to start the program, the plan, whatever.
Austerity, whatever.
Well, whatever's been planned for Lebanon, okay? So the thing is, the way I see it is all these things happening in the region, all these conflicts and wars and invasions and aggressions are because of Iran. Essentially, this is not a war between Israel and Iran or a war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This is a war between the United States against Iran. It has been for the entirety of Iran's history since the revolution. These other countries are merely American proxies in the region, right? They invaded and occupied Iraq and lost it to the Shia majority, but have always had a hand in there and kept it, a balance between Iran and the United States, but kept the country poor and needy. So none of the things the U.S. promised Iraq ever came through, except security roads and security measures that benefited the Americans. Okay, no agricultural policies, no, nothing. And then the war moved at the same time that Obama withdrew from Iraq, withdrew U.S. forces from Iraq. The war started in Syria. So the Americans they failed in Iraq, and after Iraq and Afghanistan, American citizens had no appetite for the blood and treasure that they'd lost in these two aggressions. And so Syria had to be different. So jihadists and gunmen from around the world, from 80 plus countries, were recruited by Saudis, Emiratis, Qataris, Turks, US allies in the region, to basically back up the revolution with arms and trickery and
boots on the ground.
Boots on the ground. It was right. They were foot soldiers. Jihadis were foot soldiers for the Americans, essentially, in that conflict. But they did not anticipate Iran and Hezbollah getting directly involved on the ground. They did not anticipate a major power like Russia coming onto the scene, China backing Russia in the UN Security Council, they didn't anticipate the level and strength and advancement of Russian weapons, and how far Russia was willing to go in this scenario. So they lost Syria. Now, they lost Syria, and it was a miserable loss, and a lot of money was thrown at that conflict. I mean, basically, the combined resources of NATO and the GCC were thrown at Syria, okay? Not a wealthy state, and Syria survived, okay? Broken, but survived. Same like Iraq, broken, but survived. And they do this like slow bloodletting. They try to eke out the suffering as long as possible, but via sanctions for Syria. That was the next step. And truly, Syrians are having a very rough time, unable to afford things, unable to import necessities, etc. And so, having lost in Syria, they go back to where they started in 2006, which was trying to eradicate Hezbollah, right? They come back because there's a whole new scenario in Lebanon, and things have shifted, but the Americans are using, there is a war in Lebanon. Let's make it clear, there is a war against Lebanon. Lebanon is under a US siege. There's no two ways to describe, I mean, it's so incredible in the English speaking Lebanese community. You don't really hear this. You don't hear about this being an economic war against Lebanon. It's an economic war against Syria, but no, in Lebanon, it's not an economic war. And the siege, I mean, first we saw the port, which handled about 80% of Lebanese imports via sea. The Beirut port exploded in, one of the biggest explosions the world has ever seen. You would have to have 5 coincidences for that to have happened. The guy with the torch thing who was trying to fix this, and nobody in Lebanon actually believes it was an accident. Official reports and investigations all say it was an accident, incidentally, but nobody actually believes that. At that point, and that came very, it came a good half a year after the banks started shutting down. And as the money situation was getting tighter and tighter and people couldn't get money out of the banks, then this happened. And then the funny thing about this incident was the next day, the Lebanese lira gained strength, which showed basically everybody in the country that the lira is absolutely manipulated and manipulatable, because there's no way that you have, one of the biggest explosions in the history of the world. Yeah. And you have a big section of the Lebanese population, a rather wealthy Christian neighborhoods that happen to be hardest hit by this, and then there's,
and then the currency goes up.
The currency goes up there. So right, so we could see these things, and there are many things like this. And now it's the big squeeze. We remove subsidies. What are you going to do? So one of the things I find very interesting is a few months ago, actually it's more than a few months ago, Hezbollah has opened a chain of supermarkets in the areas that, they've always been in, across Lebanon. And it's for people, you have to get a membership card, and it's for people who can't afford it, and you have to show that you can't afford it. And then things are very strongly subsidized, and most of the goods, from what I understand, come from Iran. Okay, so in Lebanon's time of need, Iran's coming with the, low-priced good products to feed a portion of the Lebanese population. You don't have to be a Shiite to access this food. You don't have to be in those areas to access this food. You just have to show need. And at the same time, in other communities in Tripoli, which is a heavily Sunni area in the north of Lebanon, you also have local leaders and politicians coming to the aid, creating food banks, etc. I actually heard a Western journalist call it buying votes. And I thought, are you kidding me? If an NGO, an American NGO came and was doling out food, you wouldn't be calling that like American soft power trying to influence, the Lebanese people. You wouldn't ever say that.
Interesting.
But you have local politicians who are voted in by actual Lebanese constituencies, and they shouldn't be doling out food to their constituents. Who else are they going to be helping other than their constituents? So, there's a kind of wrong language about this. Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, in several speeches back said, as things were getting rougher here, he said, the Lebanese people will not starve. Okay, so that actually gave a lot of people comfort to some extent, thinking whether you like Hezbollah or not here, you know that when Hassan Nasrallah says something, and even the Israelis know this, when he says something, he's going to do it. So people anticipated that he would sort of sweep in and make sure that there was food and whatever. But it's a tough call because, you know, Hezbollah is damned if they do and damned if they don't in almost anything they do. But I suspect that Lebanon will reach a situation where security forces will have to step in and secure the country and ensure that basic commodities are available to people. Otherwise, the insecurity will continue. And at that point, I think we will see the border with Syria forced open. By the way, during this whole process, after the port, et cetera, the Americans brought their Caesar Act into the region and basically forbidding countries at risk to their economy of doing any trade with Syria, okay, of having any goods passing through Syria. Otherwise, they'd be complicit in war crimes committed by Syria, ostensibly, right? And that, in effect, had the Lebanese politicians shut down the border with Syria. So of course, there's always smuggling going on. But guess who's long ago, meaning in the recent years, built towers along the Syrian border? The British government. You know, it's just one piece after another. So there's nobody should describe what's happening in Lebanon as financial difficulties, corruption, et cetera. That exists, but that's always existed. The problem in Lebanon is there's a war against Lebanon, and we're under siege by the Americans and their allies. So there's no other way we need to be discussing the crisis here. Of course, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't address the domestic problems. The Lebanese have to do that. Yeah. Okay. But the reason the domestic problems can't get resolved is because the foreign interference will not have their politicians, and they won't let them go. You know, so that's in a nutshell.
Boy, that's complicated and hard to watch, knowing that any of my earnings or whatever are funding that kind of thing. It's very hard to watch that happen. Not that that helps anybody, but if anybody here really understood, I doubt it would ever get much support. Let's put it that way. Yeah. And they never talk about what our policies really are, or what we're really doing. So, but anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about. So one other thing, again, that this resistance, the difference now between the resistance, say the last time 2014 in Gaza and the way it is now, there were stories about and footage about people gathering in Lebanon intending to go to Palestine. Is that something new? And what is this difference that we're seeing? I have a quote here from, is this the right pronunciation? Ibn Riyad?
Yes.
Okay, so this is from Twitter. One of my listeners sent it. And he said, this is part of the new equation set by the Palestinian resistance. The bombing of civilians in Gaza is met with the bombing of the occupation capital, Tel Aviv. These are heady days, comrades. At around the same time, an event took place in Lebanon with speeches from Chairman of the Executive Council of the Lebanese Resistance, Saeed Hashem Safi al-Din, and Secretary General of PIJ, to which the armed wing Saraya al-Quds belongs. And then they have a quote here from Saeed Safi al-Din. He says, "We in the Lebanese resistance are with the Palestinian people in a single cause and a single battle. Your rockets are our rockets. Your victory and our victory are a single victory, God willing." So the kind of unity that you talked about inside Israel and the Palestinian territories. It looks like it's not just limited to that. Again, I'm not quite sure that I ever knew enough to know if this is typical or not. But what are we seeing from the broader resistance that you mentioned in what a little bit earlier? What are we seeing from them in response to the attack on Gaza and the attacks in Jerusalem and so on?
So the Lebanese resistance has always supported the Palestinian resistance. There's nothing new in that. And frankly, I don't know enough to say that every time there's something in Gaza, I mean, certainly in the time I've been coming here, every time there's something in Gaza, the Lebanese resistance speaks out in favor of the Palestinian resistance. But we have to keep this in context of what's also been happening at the onset of the Syrian conflict. As I was saying earlier, you know, we saw the Lebanese, Hezbollah in particular, but even the Lebanese army cooperate with the Syrian government. I mean, basically, the Lebanese, the Syrians, the Iraqis, and the Iranians were cooperating on multiple security, military, transportation, access, intelligence,
Supply lines, yeah.
They learned a lot about each other's needs and insecurities, and they worked together for the first time. And very recently, but you know, I'm terrible at remembering these things because it's been in my mind for so long. I don't remember when someone officially said it. But these sort of Lebanon, Syria, the resistance axis, Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, the Palestinian resistance, and elements in Iraq, you know, the pro-resistance Iraqi military units are of one mind in the sense that they have said on different occasions that if one gets attacked, we're all in, okay, or they've suggested that. But I think they've actually said that in some instances here and there. And we saw something very interesting when the Israelis, sabotaged, I guess is the right word, because there wasn't an explosion there. I think the electricity was just cut off. The Natanz nuclear facility in Iran, we saw a missile coming from Syria and hitting nearby Dimona as a clear message. Yeah. But Iran didn't shoot the missile, Syria did, right? And the Israelis didn't respond properly to that. I mean, this was a huge deal. This was a huge deal inside Israel because it was a clear message, but Syria acted as though it was Iran acting. And we're gonna see these crossovers a lot more now, okay? So you should not be surprised to see the Palestinians act if Lebanon gets attacked in some way, or the Lebanese act if the Palestinians get attacked, or the Syrians act if now they've worked together. They understand the common threats they have, and they're in lockstep. So this is inevitable. You know, the Americans fortified an alliance that had been there and was truly an alliance, but they really fortified it. You know, as they always say, American congressmen race to say there's no space between us and Israel. I mean, the resistance axis is glued tight now, you know. So it's interesting because after the Natanz incident, a series of events happened in the region, and people questioned whether Iran was behind them. I mean, first of all, some Israeli ships, I think an Israeli ship was held up or boarded or something, you know. People have been taking each other's ships a lot in this region lately. And it's important because when they would do this, when they would, you know, commandeer or try to obstruct Iranian shipping routes, like taking oil to its ally in Syria, for instance, Iran then would hit back somewhere else, and then they had to release them. And I mean, this is a silly part of the great game, tactical stuff. But recently, the commander in chief of the IRGC, Major General Hossein Salami, did an interview. This is in just, I think, past days. And he alluded to, it seems to me that he said that Iran or the resistance axis was involved in many of the incidents, the strange and unexplained incidents that took place in Israel. Okay, not so long ago. So he says, if I could read, he talks about the bubble of Israel's national security bursting. Okay, that what's happening now is they believed stuff for so long. They thought they were invincible, that they had the qualitative military edge, that in fact they were peeling apart Arabs from each other, but the Gulf Arabs never really mattered to the resistance axis. They didn't, really impact them. So, the Bahrain, Morocco, the United Arab Emirates, opening relations with Israel, it just makes them look bad. And of course, now with Palestinians besieged and being killed and injured in the hundreds and thousands, these people have nothing to say, these other Arab countries.
Yeah, they're doing nothing.
Yeah. So they had this false sense of, we're on the move, we're getting places. Okay, if this had happened 30 years ago, it would have been meaningful, but it wasn't. It's happening now when basically Iran's foes in the region are all clamoring to throw something at Iran, even if it's an alliance on paper, it doesn't matter. So he says Israel's bubble of national security has burst now. Okay, and that they're soon going to see, if they have not already seen, that they're trapped in the same decaying phenomenon that is happening in many Western countries, in America and the UK. I mean, we see economy, what is it? Debts that will never be paid back, national debts, the likes that we've not heard of before, and political chaos and social chaos and real polarization in these are decaying. This is the decaying empire, but Israel's national security bubble has now just burst. And he says they cover it up. They cover up these things, okay, to give an appearance of authority and control, which goes to my point about how on day one of bombing Gaza, the Israelis are the ones to run to the UN Security Council, to Egypt, to the United States, to France, to get a ceasefire in motion so that they don't have to go too long, because you know what? They run out of weapons. They run out of weapons, okay? And they run out of ways to keep a hold on their propaganda, which is, we're the David, they're the Goliath, right? We start to see otherwise. And so they have to have short bursts of aggression, which otherwise they can't sustain it. Major General Salami says, approximately a month or so ago, all of the Zionist regime's vulnerabilities were exposed. It was demonstrated that commercial navigation and shipping of the Zionist regime in every part of the globe is vulnerable. Okay, again, alluding to Israeli ships being stopped and harassed. 90% of the commerce and goods exchange occurs through the seawater because it does not have any land borders. In effect, if their shipping is hindered and obstructed, Israel can't get the supplies it's been used to, right? They basically own they get their supplies via sea. But then he says, ports. Before this, no one could imagine significant vulnerabilities in maritime commerce. Very simply, it's possible to create serious harm in Zionist regime's maritime commerce. This is one issue. He says they thought, that is, they wish to portray that the security system of the regime is invulnerable when that severe explosion with that huge mushroom as a result of an explosion similar to a nuclear explosion occurred in the air defense engine factory and the factory that was manufacturing the Zionist regime satellites. All of a sudden, it seemed as if this air-filled balloon with the push of a needle deflated in its entirety, and they were shown how vulnerable they are. And then he says, but they were just starting a domino. After that, in Haifa, a large refinery exploded that led to the leakages from ammonia tanks. They announced that 80 of their firms had been the subject of cyber attacks. Near Ben Gurion Airport, another explosion occurred. Their spies in Iraq and Erbil were killed. So that's a confirmation, in fact, that these were Israeli spies that were killed in Erbil. Nobody ever sorted out that story. in wherever an explosion occurred, that particular missile hit near Dimona. That attack demonstrated that so many diverse layers of anti-missile defense established in the Zionist regime, from David Sling to Patriot defense system to Iron Dome. And he says none of these work. So Israel's bubble has been burst. And he does suggest that, these were not accidents. But again, I would reinforce that it doesn't mean they were conducted by Iran. Okay, you have
just some part of the resistance across.
Who's the head of the Qassam brigades, who has been wanted by Israel for 20 years and is still in action, has never been caught by the Israelis. And he's long spoken about taking the battle inside Israel. So you don't know where this comes from, and that will make Israel crazier. The resistance axis working in unison, Palestinian units coming together as one, Israel having no strategic depth, and their maritime access being vulnerable really puts some shocks into the system, and I think altogether should act as a deterrence. But you never know what crazy can do.
Yeah. Too many times we see people doubling down, which, you just don't know which way it's going to go, whether to say, all right, we understand. And this, most of all applies to the United States right now. What decision will be made? Accept the current situation and, start to pull things back in and just, be a player among players in a multipolar world, accept this situation and make the best of it, which could be done, or double down.
Well, let them double down. The thing is, I don't think the resistance axis is scared. I mean, I have to say, if we were watching in 2020 when your idiot president assassinated an Iranian general in a foreign country, in Iraq, alongside a major Iraqi
during
general.
A diplomatic mission, supposedly.
Yeah. So, when that happened, I'm sure Trump did a little victory lap, whatever. But that was the end of that very quickly. When Iran shot in a dozen ballistic missiles, pinpoint targeting of U.S. military bases and particular places within these bases. Okay, and the Americans did not react. It was over. They're not going to be able to react. They're seeing things for the first time from Iran. They're seeing not just Iran. They're seeing Hezbollah. They're seeing Palestinians surround Israel and are inside Israel. Okay. And Syrians, right? They're seeing them respond militarily if necessary, and so they have to be thinking twice, especially since you're not picking off these countries one by one anymore, because they're saying we're all in.
Yeah, that's a great way to sort of sum it up. While I still have you, I saw your announcement on Twitter about a new media project, an independent media project. And I'm dying to hear more about it, because some of the names that you mentioned are some of my favorites, and including you. And I'd like to hear how that's going, or whatever you're ready to talk about at this point.
Yeah, we're hoping by sort of mid-June, it'll be online. It's an online project. I would describe it more of a news magazine. Mm-hmm. We do have daily news on it, but it's not our core. Our core offering is 3 sections: investigations, interviews, and analysis. Mm-hmm. And what we hope to bring is, in the English language, a worldview that is represented by in tens of millions of people from the Levant to the Persian Gulf, and that you never hear in English. And when people say, "Oh, we miscalculated again in the Middle East," because you'll know nothing. You'll know nothing, right? So we're going to upset some people, but they will know things at least. They will know what's going on in the region, and we will as many of us covering the region in the last 10 years have done. We've consistently predicted outcomes when they couldn't. And so you'll have to read us to know what's going to happen in the region. And I think we hope to also define the region for ourselves increasingly. You know, when I see local even pro-resistance media talk about Hezbollah strongholds because they report in English and they just mimic the language. We're being manipulated by language, okay? Language that defines us and describes us and has entered our collective consciousness. That's a war in itself, okay? We want to decolonize minds, okay? We do have our own language, our own writers, our own thinkers, you know, and we need them to define what's coming in this region, and you know, to reflect what people actually think. So you'll often hear that Lebanon is split in two, okay, in terms of, you know, it's polarized in two people, pro-America, pro-resistance. It's not all true. I mean, Hezbollah hands down won the last elections in Lebanon, the last parliamentary elections, right? They won the last election. Second was Hezbollah's allies, the Free Patriotic Movement headed by now President Michel Aoun, the largest Christian political party in this country. And third was the other side. And fourth was Amal, run by Nabi Berri, again, a resistance axis ally. So, I mean, they swept it, you know. There is a majority in this country that thinks otherwise. And everybody now criticizes the United States because they know that the economic squeeze is because the West doesn't want to help Lebanon right now or wants to squeeze Lebanon now. So, you know, basically, we need to have new voices, existing voices, but in English. People need to know what's going on in this region. We need to frame our events ourselves. We need to advance our predictions ourselves. And, you know, I think we all hope to sort of create or raise a stable of native journalists who can speak out on foreign media as well to explain what's happening in this region in a more rational and factual manner. So we're really excited. The reason we focus on these three things, because there isn't a lot of, there's not a culture of investigative journalism in this part of the world. You know, the sort of like the big story, the long read, that's not such a thing. And they tend to be short analysis pieces, short op-eds, short news pieces. There are some exceptional journalists here. I mean, really exceptional. And I want to draw investigative pieces out of them. There are thousands of questions that all of us journalists have. We need to match the right journalist with the right story, and collectively we can do this quite easily. It will not be a daily publication, but you know, when we have investigations underway, answering a lot of the questions that haven't been answered in the last decade, you know, since things blew up in this region, interviews of people we never hear from. Yeah. I remember my first visit to Lebanon over a decade ago was to interview Hamas and Hezbollah for the Huffington Post. And I sort of did a in their own words kind of thing, question, answer, let them speak. And I remember the comment section, people saying, well, they sound really rational. You know, and so here's the thing, like, hear what they have to say and you might have a different impression. So that's never really allowed in the Western media. So I think we hope to interview people. I'm not just talking resistance axis. I mean, there are many things happening here. People are considering other economic directions, you know, other political directions, other military directions. I mean, Jordan, for instance, is getting no help from its friends and only pressure from the Saudis, the Americans, and Israelis. What's Jordan going to do when it runs out of cash? You know, Iraq and Syria will probably help. Being able to trade with Iraq and Syria, because Jordan has a lot of factories and does produce things, you know, as well as human resources. And so those are all possibilities. And we have to be looking at new directions because this region has been stripped, you know, and so there are many things. There are economists, there are diplomats, politicians, resistance people. that need to be interviewed. And then the third aspect is analysis. Along all these three categories, I hope to, in every piece, either bring new information to the table or a new slant on events or existing information. And, we hope people will read it and like it, or let it make you angry, come at it, engage, because we're all going to learn through this process. I don't think there's ever been a publication like this in English. There was Al Akhbar had an English section for a few years, and that unfortunately was shut down. But it was really important to have those kind of views represented. And I think a lot of people did learn a lot from Al Akhbar English while it was around. So we hope to do something similar, but at a different level, with very experienced journalists and experts. And as they come on, we will announce them, on Twitter and other social media places. Yeah. Just surprise. We have a couple of really nice columnists. We will cover, by the way, from the Levant to the Persian Gulf. And I just going to this summer have a Turkish columnist join us because, when we do Levant to the Persian Gulf, it's all Arab world that we're focused on, and then Iran. But Turkey is going to be a big player in the political and economic direction of this region potentially. So, you'll find it all here, hopefully.
I'm looking forward to it. Do you think there'll be coverage of Yemen? Will you be able to extend that far?
Yeah,
or?
Because it is Persian Gulf, and
okay,
Yemen. I mean, all eyes are on Yemen in this region right now, even if it's not covered in the Western media, which it really isn't, except for a few human rights stories here and there. There are critical things happening in Yemen that is going to change the power balance greatly, potentially. And so the two poles here are still trying to gain leverage on the ground to see who can come out of that one better. Yeah. But it's pretty clear to me, at least, who will. And you can read about it in our new publication.
Good.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. I don't want to get off track, but there's, a couple of stories are told about Yemen, but beyond that, you don't get a lot of depth. So I'm looking forward to understanding more about those. And this is a great way do you have enough time for a quick bonus question? All right, if you don't mind, then if there's anything you want to say before we roll into a bonus question, but it's a pretty basic bonus question. I noticed a tweet that you had, and it was basically the progression of the map of Israel and Palestine from back in, after World War II until today. Basically, it was Palestine, and then more and more of it became Israel. And you believe that Palestine will reemerge. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that and where you see the trend of this whole thing going. The answer to the bonus question is in the extra bonus segment for patrons. You can get access to all bonus content by subscribing at Rockfin or Patreon, plus other perks like patron live streams, Zoom calls, and access to our Discord channel where we can talk among ourselves. So that's my pitch, and I hope that some of you will join us. And now I'll continue with the interview wrap-up. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Sharmine. It was great talking with you again. Anything that you want to let everybody know, where to find your work, how to support the new project, the new media outlet, and anything else that you want to say as we wrap up?
Well, follow me on Twitter at @snarwani, and we will have updates on the media project and its exact date of launch. Like I said, it should be hopefully mid-June, and sign up to get our our updated investigations, interviews, and analysis, because it will be unlike what you've seen from this region before. So, it's really just about making sure people know that something like this exists. And we're really excited, This is a new beginning for this region. People always say, you're so optimistic, but you just have to know what's coming. If you can see everything collapsing, there's going to be new.
something, right? And you have to look at who's efficient today. There's only one poll that is displaying any efficiency, any vision, common agendas, and those are the people who are going to form the new economic order, the new global networks, the new hegemons. So of course I'm optimistic, because they're actually the good guys and they're efficient and they're cleaning up. So I am very optimistic, but there are troubles ahead, and you can read all about it in our new publication.
All right, we'll do that. Thanks so much. Take good care.
Thank you, Joanne. You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Sharmine Narwani. Follow her on Twitter at @snarwani. Find her work at her website, MIDI Shuffle, and stay tuned for a new media outlet that she will be launching in just a few weeks. This podcast is independent media. Listener support's really important. rockfin.com/aroundtheempire, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Find this any mobile podcast app or on the website aroundtheempire.com, on Rockfin, Patreon, YouTube. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Follow on Twitter @aroundtheempire, and we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody.